This is a reading from the Little Flowers of St. Francis. The life of Brother Juniper. 1. How Brother Juniper cut off a pig's foot just to give it to a sick man. One of the most elect first disciples and companions of St. Francis was Brother Juniper, a man of such unshakable humility, patience, and self-contempt that the rushing waves of temptation and tribulation could not move him. His patience is said to have been so remarkable that no one ever saw him disturbed, even when under great pressure. He reached such a degree of self-contempt that he was considered stupid and foolish by those who did not know how perfect he was. Therefore, St. Francis once, when he was speaking about the outstanding virtue of his companion, said, he would be a good friar minor who had attained to Brother Juniper's contempt of self and of the world. Now, one day, Brother Juniper was visiting a certain sick friar at St. Mary of the Portioncula, and when he saw him suffering very much from his illness, Brother Juniper's heart melted with compassion and burned with fervent charity. So he asked the friar, "Can I help you in any way? Do you want something to eat?" The sick friar answered, "I would love to eat a pig's foot if I had one." Brother Juniper quickly said, "Leave that to me, I'll soon have one, and prepare it the way you want." He went and took a knife from the kitchen and ran into the fields where he found a group of pigs feeding. He ran after one of them, caught it, and cut off one of its feet with the knife, leaving the pig with its leg maimed. He came back and washed and dressed and cooked the pig's foot, and after he had prepared it well, he brought and served it with great kindness to the sick friar. The latter ate it very eagerly, to Brother Juniper's intense joy and consolation, and to entertain him, Juniper gleefully described how he had caught the pig. Meanwhile, however, the man who was guarding the swine, who had seen him cut off the foot, told his master the whole story with great indignation. When the master heard about it, he went to the friar's place and shouted at them, calling them hypocrites, thieves, forgers, bandits, and evil men for having the deliberate malice to cut off one of his pig's feet. At all the noise he was making, St. Francis came out with the others and very humbly made excuses for his friars, saying that he had not known about what had happened. Yet, to appease him, he promised that he would make good the damage. But the man would not calm down. Raging with anger, he uttered many curses and threats, repeating over and over that the pig's foot had been cut off with deliberate malice. He refused to accept any excuses or promises, and he left in unappeased anger and indignation, shouting curses and insults. While the other friars stood around in amazement, St. Francis prudently thought the matter over and said to himself, "Could Brother Juniper have done this out of indiscreet zeal?" He immediately summoned Brother Juniper privately and asked him, "Did you cut off the foot of a pig in the fields?" Then Brother Juniper, acting not like someone who has done something wrong, but like one who believes he has performed a great act of charity, answered joyfully, "Dear Father, it is true. I cut that pig's foot off, and now listen compassionately to the reason. I went to visit that sick friar," and he told him the whole story. On hearing it, St. Francis was very sad, and with zeal for justice, his face flushed. He said, "Oh, Brother Juniper, why did you bring this great disgrace on us? That man is quite right in being angry at us, and now maybe he is complaining about us and spoiling our reputation throughout the town, and he has good reason to do so. Therefore, I now order you under holy obedience to run right after that man until you overtake him, and to throw yourself on the ground before him and admit your guilt to him, and promise to make good the damage, and do it in such a way that he will have no more reason to complain against us, for this certainly has been a most serious wrong." Brother Juniper was very much surprised at these words, as he marveled that anyone should be angry over such an act of charity, for to him all these material things seemed like nothing, except if they were put to use in practicing charity. And he replied, "Father, you can be sure I will quickly give him full satisfaction. But why should he be so angry when something that belonged to God rather than to him was used to perform such a real act of charity?" Then he ran off and overtook the man, who was still so angry that he had not an ounce of patience left. With intense joy and fervor, Brother Juniper told him all about the amputation of the pig's foot, as though he had done him a great favor for which he deserved a reward. The man's anger only increased, and he became so enraged that he shouted insults at him, calling him a fool, a lunatic, and the worst kind of criminal, and he almost struck him. Brother Juniper was amazed at these ugly words, although he rejoiced at receiving the insults, and because he thought that the man had not understood what he had said, which seemed to him a matter for joy rather than anger, He told him the same story over again, and he embraced the man, explaining how it had been done only out of love, and urging the man to congratulate him for doing such a good deed, and even inviting the man to give the rest of the pig for the same purpose. Then that man was overcome by so much simplicity and humility, and recovering his senses, when he heard that the cause of the deed had been an act of charity, he knelt down and wept, and admitted that he had been wrong in insulting Brother Juniper and the other holy friars. And he acknowledged that perhaps he was greedy and ungrateful to God for the good things which he possessed. So he went and caught and killed the pig, and had it cooked and well dressed. And with great devotion and weeping he brought it to St. Mary of the Angels, and gave it to those holy friars to eat, as compensation for the wrong which he had done them. Now St. Francis, considering the simplicity and self-contempt and patience under adversity of that holy Brother Juniper, said to his companions and the other friars who were standing around, "My brothers, if only I had a great forest of such junipers, to the glory of Christ." Amen. 2. An example of Brother Juniper's great power against the devil. The proud devils could not endure Brother Juniper's presence, because he was so humble and pure and innocent. For once, a certain man who was possessed by a devil, acting in a strange and unusual way, left the road he was on and rapidly fled 7 miles along side roads. When his relatives who were following him asked why he had so suddenly run away, he answered, "Because that stupid Brother Juniper was coming along that road, and I could not stand his presence." They investigated and found that Brother Juniper had indeed come along at that time, and as the devil had said. Therefore, St. Francis used to say, when possessed persons were brought to him to be healed, if the devil did not immediately leave them at his command, "If you do not go out of this person at once, I will have Brother Juniper come and deal with you." Then the devil, fearing the presence of Brother Juniper and being unable to endure the virtue and humility of St. Francis, quickly went away. To the glory of Christ. Amen. 3. How the devil plotted to have Brother Juniper condemned to be hanged. Therefore the devil, wishing to make Brother Juniper suffer by some worldly means, went to a very cruel tyrant named Nicholas, who was the lord of a castle and village, and who was then at war with the city of Viterbo. And he said to him, "Sir, watch out for this castle of yours, because soon a great traitor will be sent here by the men of Viterbo to kill you, and set fire to your castle. And I give you these clues that this is true. He goes around dressed like a poor man, with tattered and patched clothes and a torn cowl hanging on his shoulders. And he is carrying an awl with which to kill you. And he has with him a flint and steel to set fire to this castle. And if you do not find this to be true, punish me any way you wish." Nicholas the tyrant was very much surprised and frightened by these words, because the man who said them seemed to be trustworthy. So he immediately ordered that the gates should be carefully watched, and that if a man with those signs should come, he should be brought before him at once. Meanwhile, Brother Juniper came to that village, and he was alone, for owing to his perfection, he had been given permission by his minister to go about and stay, without a companion, as he pleased, and he met some rowdy boys who as a joke damaged and tore his cowl. He did not mind, but rather encouraged and helped them to make even more fun of him. While the guards were watching at the gate, Brother Juniper came up with his habit mostly cut off, for he had given parts of it to some poor man on the way, and with his cowl torn, not looking at all like a friar minor. And as he clearly showed the signs that he'd been given them, they quickly rushed upon him, seized him, and led him before the tyrant. And when they carefully searched him for offensive weapons, they found in his sleeve an awl with which he used to mend his sandals, and also a flint which he carried to light a fire, because he used to have headaches and often lived in the woods and solitary places. On seeing the signs with him, which agreed with the devil's statement, Nicholas immediately ordered them to twist a cord round his head and tighten it with a bar, and they did so with such cruelty that the cord was almost buried in his flesh. Then they put him on the rack and pulled and wrenched his arms and disjointed his whole body, without showing any mercy. And when in that condition he was questioned as to who he was, he answered, "I am a very great sinner." And when he asked whether he wanted to betray the castle and give it over to the people of Viterbo, he replied, "I am a great traitor, and do not deserve any good." And when asked whether he wanted to kill the tyrant Nicholas, with that all, and to burn the castle? He answered, I would do much greater and worse things if God allowed me to. Then Nicholas, overcome by his fury, did not wish to continue the questioning, but without further delay angrily sentenced Brother Juniper as a traitor and murderer to be tied to a horse's tail and dragged through the village to the gallows, and there to be hanged by the throat at once. Now at all this, Brother Juniper did not offer any excuses, and he showed no sorrow, but rather, like someone who rejoices in tribulations for the love of God, he looked very joyful and glad. And when the tyrant's order was being carried out, and Brother Juniper's feet were tied to the tail of a horse, and he was dragged over the ground to be hanged, he did not complain or lament, but went along in all humility, like a gentle lamb being led to the slaughter. This sight and the sudden sentencing brought a great crowd of people on the run to see the prompt and cruel execution, and no one knew him. However, as God willed, a certain good man who had seen Brother Juniper being arrested and then sentenced ran to the place of the friars minor of that village and called the guardian, saying, For God's sake, please come quickly, because a poor man has been arrested and immediately sentenced and is being led to execution. Come, so that he can at least commit his soul into your hands, because he seems like a good man to me, and he has not had time for confession. And they are taking him to be hanged, but he does not seem to care about death or the salvation of his soul. Please come quickly. The guardian, who was a zealous and compassionate man, immediately hastened to him to persuade him to confess and to try to save his soul. But when he arrived, the crowd that had gathered to see this execution had grown so large that he could not make his way through it. So he stood there and waited. And while he was waiting, he heard a voice in the crowd shouting, Don't do that, you naughty fellows! That rope is hurting my leg! On hearing this, the guardian thought he recognized Brother Juniper's voice. He strenuously pushed his way through the crowd and succeeded in reaching him. And when he tore away at the linen cloth which usually covered the face of the person to be executed, he realized at once that it was indeed Brother Juniper, and he was understandably amazed. Then Brother Juniper, paying no attention to his sufferings and wounds, saw the guardian and said to him, half smiling, "Oh, guardian, how fat you are!" Grieving and weeping, the compassionate guardian wanted to take off his own habit and give it to Brother Juniper, but the latter said with a smile and cheerful expression, "No, guardian, you are fat, and you would not look good without your habit. I don't want it." Then the guardian tearfully asked the executioners and all the people standing around to wait a while for pity's sake, until he went to beg the tyrant Nicholas to have mercy on Brother Juniper. The executioners and the people sympathized with him, thinking that he was related to the prisoner, and they agreed to wait for the tyrant's answer. Then the devout and compassionate guardian went to the tyrant Nicholas and said to him, weeping bitterly, "Sir, I can't tell you how amazed and how sad I am, because I believe that today in this place a greater sin and a greater wrong has been committed than was ever done in the days of our ancestors. But I believe that it was done through ignorance." Nicholas listened patiently to the guardian and asked him, "What is the great crime and evil that has been committed in this place today?" The guardian answered, "That one of the holiest friars in the whole world living today in the order of St. Francis, for whom you have a special devotion, has been sentenced by you to a very cruel punishment, I fully believe without justification." Nicholas said, "Now tell me, guardian, who he is, for perhaps without knowing I have done a great wrong." The guardian said, "He whom you condemned to death is Brother Juniper, the companion of St. Francis." Nicholas the tyrant was utterly astounded, because he had already heard about Brother Juniper's fame and his holy life. Overcome with horror, he trembled and turned pale. Then he ran quickly with the guardian to Brother Juniper and untied him from the horse's tail and set him free. And before all the people he threw himself on the ground in front of Brother Juniper, and weeping bitterly, he humbly admitted his guilt for the harm and offense which he had caused to be done to this holy friar, and he begged to be forgiven. "I truly believe that the end of my evil deeds and my life is approaching, for since I have treated this holy man so cruelly without being guilty, although I did not know it, God will not tolerate me any longer, and I will soon die a violent death." Brother Juniper generously forgave Nicholas the tyrant and went away, rejoicing in the Lord, because he had conquered himself and had been willing to be despised for the love of Christ, and he left all the people very edified, to the glory of God. Amen. 4. How Brother Juniper used to give whatever he could to the poor for the love of God. Brother Juniper had so much pity and compassion for the poor that when he saw anyone who was badly clothed or bare, he would immediately rip off his sleeve or cowl or some piece of his habit and give it to that poor man, And so the guardian ordered him under obedience not to give all or part of his habit to anyone. A few days later it happened that he met a poor man who was almost naked, and who begged Brother Juniper to give him something for the love of God. And Juniper said to him very compassionately, "My dear man, I have nothing to give you except my habit, and my superior has told me under obedience not to give it or part of it away to anyone. But if you pull it off my back, I certainly will not prevent you." He was not speaking to a deaf man, for he immediately pulled the habit off inside out and went away with it, leaving Brother Juniper naked. When he went back to the place, the friars asked him where his habit was, and he answered, "Some good person pulled it off my back and went away with it." And as the virtue of compassion grew in him, he was not satisfied with giving away only his habit, but to the poor he used to give books and ornaments for the altar and cloaks of the other friars and whatever he could lay his hands on. Consequently, when poor people came to Brother Juniper to beg, the friars used to take and hide the things they wanted to keep, so that Brother Juniper should not find them, for he used to give everything away for the love of God and for his praise, to the glory of Christ. Amen. 5. How Brother Juniper cut some ringlets from the altar and gave them away. Once, when Brother Juniper was at the friary in Assisi for the feast of the Lord's Nativity, he was in the church near the main altar, which was very beautifully draped and decorated. At the request of the sacristan, he stayed to guard the altar while the sacristan went to get a bite to eat. While he was devoutly meditating, a poor little woman begged him to give her something for the love of God, and he answered, "Wait a minute, I'll see if I can find anything to give you from this richly decorated altar." Now there was on the altar a very costly frontal, from which were hanging some silver ringlets. And when Brother Juniper looked at the ornate altar, he saw the silver ringlets and said, "These ringlets are superfluous." And taking a knife, he cut all of them off the frontal and gave them to the poor little woman out of compassion. Meanwhile, the sacristan, after eating 3 or 4 mouthfuls, began to remember the ways of Brother Juniper, and to fear that in his zeal for charity he might do some damage to the richly decorated altar which he had left in his guard. So he quickly rose from the table and went to the church. And when, on looking over the ornaments of the altar, he saw that the ringlets had been cut away and stripped from the frontal, he became exceedingly angry and indignant. Brother Juniper saw how excited he was and said, "Don't be upset about those ringlets, because I gave them to a poor little woman who was in great need. They were good for nothing except here to make a display of worldly vanity." On hearing this, the sacristan became furious and immediately ran through the church and the whole city, anxiously trying to find the woman. But not only did he not find her, he found no one who had seen her. So he returned to the friary and angrily took the frontal to the Minister General, John Parenti, who was then in Assisi, and said, "Father General, I demand justice from you against Brother Juniper, who has destroyed this frontal for me, and it was the finest one in the sacristy. Now look how he has ruined it and stripped away all the silver ringlets, and he says he has given them to a poor woman." Brother John the General answered, "Brother Juniper did not do this, but your foolishness, because you assigned him to guard the altar. Don't you know his ways? I tell you, I am surprised he did not give away the rest. However, I am going to correct him severely for this fault." And after vespers were chanted, he summoned all the friars in chapter, and calling Brother Juniper before him in the presence of the whole community, he rebuked him very strongly about the ringlets. And as his anger increased, he raised his voice until he became rather hoarse. Now Brother Juniper did not particularly mind those words, as he rejoiced in being blamed and humiliated, but he began to worry more about the general's hoarseness and to think of some remedy for it. So, after receiving the scolding, he went into the city and had a bowl of porridge prepared with butter. He returned late that night, and lighting a candle, he took the bowl of porridge to the general's cell and knocked. On opening the door and seeing him holding the lighted candle and the dish, the general asked quietly, "What do you want at this hour? What is it?" Brother Juniper answered, "Father, when you were scolding me in chapter for my faults, I noticed that your voice became hoarse from overstrain, I believe. So I thought of a remedy and had this porridge made for you with butter. Please eat it. I'm sure it will relieve your throat and chest." The general said, "What an hour for you to bother people." Brother Juniper replied, "Come, it was made for you. Please eat it. It will do you good." But the general was angered by the lateness of the hour and his insisting, and said, "Go away, you brute. Do you think I'm going to eat at this hour?" As Brother Juniper realized that neither begging nor persuading would help, he said to him, "Father, since you do not want to eat, and this porridge was made for you, at least do this for me. Hold the candle, and I will eat." Then the general, who was a very pious and devout man, who was won over by Brother Juniper's great compassion and simplicity and charity, for he had done it out of devotion, and he answered, Well now, brother, since you want to, let's both eat it together. And because of Brother Juniper's insistent charity, they both ate the bowl of porridge, and they were refreshed far more by their devotion than by the food. To the glory of Christ. Amen.